Hello. I think we might make a start tonight. Thank you all for coming out. I know this is the last week of semester, so it's a difficult week. I would like to start by acknowledging that we meet tonight on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung nations of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and I offer respects to their elders past and present and to emerging leaders and acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded. The electorate that the university is in is the electorate that returned 78% yes vote, the highest vote in the state, which is something heartening in this very difficult week. So we've got a fantastic panel tonight of stars. Immediately to my left is Professor Julie Willis, Dean of our faculty, co-author of a number of books, but most pertinent to tonight's discussion, her book co-authored Women Architects in Australia 1900 to 1950 and the co-edited Encyclopedia of Australian Architecture. Next to Julie is Dr. Soon-Tzu Speechley, who's a lecturer in urban and cultural heritage. His book is coming out with Bloomsbury overseas at the end of the year, and then we'll have it in our hands in Australia in about February, and it's called From the Architecture of Empire. Sorry, is that right? From the Architecture of Empire to the Asian Vernacular.
Yeah, Malayan Classicism.
Yeah, Malayan. He's from his PhD on Malayan Classicism. Next to him is Miss Sonia Sarangi, co-director of the Architectural Practice Atelier Red and Black. Yeah, well, I don't keep up. I only have my head stuck in architectural history books. I don't even use the internet, except extensively. Sonia's visiting studio critic here and tutors in the history and theory subject Asian Pacific Modernities, which is led by Professor Renoma Pires. And then at the very end, Miss Justine Clark, who is the founding partner and director of PALA, the Gender Equity Architecture Association, which is a globally innovative and cutting-edge advocacy organisation for equity in architecture. Thank you. So this panel is titled Writing Diverse Histories of Architecture, which implies that our current status quo may not be diverse. So I'm going to ask a question and then the panel is going to run away with it. That's the basic idea behind this format. So the current status quo may not be diverse. What limits and exclusions currently shape the discipline in its academic and public history formats? Buzzers ready.
Do you want me to start?
I do, darling.
Well, the profession has actually been a reasonably diverse place for a long time. It's just that what we see is not diversity. And so it takes a lot of effort to actually reveal that diversity, and there are structural reasons as to why that occurs. We have an architecture profession which is that promotes the idea of the sole designer, the artist as architect, and as a consequence, when we celebrate it, we tend to try to give credit down to a single individual, and those single individuals tend to be the owners of firms as opposed to the whole team that goes to create an architectural work. As soon as you focus on the leaders, you are automatically going to focus in on a group of people who are less diverse. And over time, over history, they tend to be men. But that doesn't mean that the production has been solely the province of men or men from particular cultural backgrounds, but it takes time to reveal this. And it's very hard to unpack without completely dismantling the ways in which we talk in shorthand about architecture and its histories. So the shorthand is the problem.
A fantastic opening comment. Would anyone else like to extend on that point about the limits and exclusions that currently shape the discipline.
I've got something to say about this because I guess I was, I actually had an answer to the first question on that list, Karen, so I'm discombobulated by this one. But I also think there's just this enormous inertia because I'm now quite old. As long as I can remember being involved in architecture, when I was taught architectural history, we would, it was taught through deconstructing the canon. We were never taught the canon as this thing that we should all follow. We were taught the canon in terms of understanding it through feminist theory, through post-colonial theory, So I guess I find it remarkable that we're still saying these problems like, the singular genius, the male genius, da-da-da. Yes, they absolutely still frame everything so much, but they've been being pulled apart for a really long time now, and I find it disturbing that extensive scholarship and extensive unpacking of things, which was going on long before, I entered architecture school a long time ago, still doesn't seem to have gained as much traction as the sort of cliches of the great hero architect. It's sort of mystifying to me that, because it's not as if people haven't been doing this work for a really long time. So I guess...
And I think the American critic and historian Despina Strategakis has talked about it more as a failure of architecture's collective memory. So the inability of all of this scholarship that's happened both in gender studies, post-colonialism, has to move into architecture's collective memory. Perhaps one of the areas where it has been most successful in Australia is through the advent of a space of Indigenous design knowledges. That seems to me that's the space that's broken.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I'm reflecting on the limited questions, I think I was very lucky to be educated in Auckland in the late 80s. When we moved to Australia, I was sort of shocked, I suppose, that quite theorised education I'd had around how history is constructed didn't seem to have been so prominent. So maybe my idea that it's been happening in architecture for a long time is actually quite geographically specific. So I don't know.
I'm jumping ahead slightly, but I'm just to take up this point, I was thinking of what you said, Soon-Tzu, about the limitations of the archive. And I'm just thinking that this actually is one of the limits for the discipline as well.
Yeah, I think, working on sort of Asian architecture, particularly in the colonial era, the things that get passed down in the record, the things that get commented on, whether it's in the newspaper or in government records, tends to focus on the imperial, on the colonial. And so that privileges a certain type of architect, a certain type of firm. And, as Julie said, it's when you start to unpack, it's when you look at the list of who was employed at these firms, when you actually sort of dig into these things, that's when you see that, even these so-called imperial monuments were constructed in large part by Asian designers, Asian builders. And so, then it comes down to who gets to call themselves an architect, who gets, sort of the credit for these buildings. And I think that's one of the things that I really was interested in unpacking was sort of even in these monuments to, British imperial rule in, say, Singapore, you then look at photos of the construction and what you see is, Chinese women migrant laborers who are building these buildings. And they don't get named, they don't really get credited. And if there's any comment on them in, say, the newspapers, it's more as an oddity or this sort of, exotic scene that, is interesting to the colonial eye. But there's, this, I guess, story that needs to be picked up and try and sort of be uncovered.
And that's fantastic because it connects to Julie's point about authorship as well. I think Sonia would...
I think this is probably the best point for me to jump in. So thank you for touching on colonial, because I think one of the limits is that our education system has really not shed a lot of its colonial lenses. And as someone who went to uni here, that was quite evident in the subjects that we're offering. And the subject that I teach for ANOMA is still the single drop that tries to look at things in the region that has 1/3 of the world's population. And yet we have only one subject on it. And it is one of the rare subjects that actually looks at the post-colonial modern period, which really gets so little oxygen. All the oxygen tends to be in that ancient colonial period, which robs the perspective of them being able to transform of their own volition in their own different paths, very, very different paths. And so students are often, sounds terrible to say, but students are often horrified at how little they know when they come into that subject. So I think those are colonial and the Oriental are certainly limits.
And I think one of the things that I've noticed over the years that even if people teach the post-war period and focus on Asia, they'll focus on the works by Le Corbusier or Khan. So there's no space which talks about the local agency in the structuring of the post-colonial nation state.
Colonialism may have ended, but our minds may still be colonized.
The paradigms we have, like regionalism, for example, assumes that all the ideas happen in a metropolitan centre. And, I'm just parroting Paul Walker here. This is not my, but, and that they kind of drift out to the edges of the empire where they're sort of watered down and received. And then I think so the very paradigms we have that are, quite dominant for thinking about architecture in places that are so-called regional are very impoverished in relation to ideas or knowledge or, So
it's a very conservative paradigm of influence. There's a brilliant scholar who's at the University of Sydney, Duan Fang Lu, who's written a book, and her phrase is entangled modernities, to understand the way in which the globe has been globalized and interconnected since, the classical world, let's just say.
Lu is the apex of the subject that we teach.
Right.
And we actually have to wait till 10 weeks when we've actually warmed students up with actually built examples from the region before we can unleash Lu on them. Because it sounds terrible, but it's still revolutionary to students when they read that.
Well, they're coming from secondary school, so they're coming with particular ideas of history, which is linear, and influence, which is unidirectional, and then starting to unpick it with terms like untangled and interconnected and exchange. All the terms that are used to describe global history requires a conceptual shift as well, I think, for students. So second question, were there turning points, key texts or people that have driven your interest in this area? So a chance for you to talk a little bit more personally about work you might admire or your own experience or people you've met.
What are you looking at me, Julie? This is the one I actually have an answer to, but I've got three. The first one, the thing that is not about architecture, actually, it's about being a 17-year-old first-year uni student and doing an anthropology course, and being a 17-year-old who thought that the challenges of gender had been dealt with by a previous generation. I think as many 17-year-olds do who've been told they can do anything, you sort of march on it and imagine you can. And being given this book to read, which was about, sort of European prehistory, I think, but it was framed entirely in terms of the activities of women, and the men came in when, procreation was needed or something, which was a total inverse of how, the history, the sort of story of prehistory had been written in every other situation. And I just do remember, at the time going, oh, it all seems a bit tiresome, it's not a problem anymore, as we know, many of us thought at some point of our life. And it really was like just this sort of lightning bolt of, so that was the. But the other thing I was thinking is, as I said before, for me, I'm sure I wasn't taught history in the most perfect way, but it was never without thinking about gender or colonization and so I think as I said, I think I was very fortunate. I think the other thing in that context, which I think is maybe useful to say in an educational environment, is that, I think there was a survey course or two, but we also had these amazing electives that were 2 credits, so they were worth very little, but they were very, very specific, and they were in whatever anyone was interested in. So there was something about, Byzantine Constantinople, there was something about medieval Cairo, there was something about Dutch modernism. So there was no pretense that you can know all about all of the architectural history. It was just like, we're going to have 6 months where we're going to look at this, and then we're going to look at that. And you could just choose. Like, there was a million of them. And all you learnt was that there was this plethora of stuff, and there's lots of ways of thinking about it. And I think that's really good, rather than here is the history of architecture, because we know you can't. I think that specificity and opening up the idea that there are a million other specificities too, I thought that was really useful. Anyway.
The university before neoliberalism. Sonia, do you have a particular turning point or person or text?
I'll try to offer one of each. Text that I can think of. I hope this doesn't sound twee and does not age me, but I remember reading Junichiro Tanizaki's In Praise of Shadows, and something just dropped in my stomach. To understand that something could be spoken about that came from culture and yet was not fetishized or described in strictly architectural terms, and that you could actually subvert completely the value system, which is, the value system being light good, shadow bad, and that you could embrace that and run with it and see it in so many different ways. I just remember reading that text and my stomach really dropped. Turning point. I know we're going to get to revisionist history at some point. But I don't know if anyone recalls here, but does anyone remember the absolute witch hunt that Zaha Hadid was subjected to in the early stages of her career? That is seared into my brain. There's a doco in there, surely.
Quite a few of the obituaries touched on that, and she herself had to engage in defending her reputation, like suing Martin Filler, the architecture critic for the New York Times. But yes, did you want to say anything more about that? Or maybe we'll talk about that more in the discussion time. Soon-Tzu.
Yeah, before I started my PhD, I was working in publishing, and so I got to see a lot of sort of interesting new books. There was a sort of wave of books on Malaysian history and architecture that were being published in the mid-2000s. And one that I worked on in particular, Kru Salma's history of the Kapitan Kling Mosque in Penang, I think was, for me, a really great example of, I guess, what sort of architecture as a social history could do. Looking at this one particular site and the community around it, which was sort of the Indian Muslim community in Penang. And that sort of looked at, I guess, how a building isn't just, its architects, it's, the people who use the space, their competing visions for what a building can be. And I think that sort of really pushed me along the trajectory I have now in terms of sort of rethinking. That's why I wanted to look at classicism in the colonial context and sort of move away from some of the narratives that had existed in existing Malaysian literature.
Well, it's going to sound all as though it's very neatly tied up, but when I was in fourth year, I did a subject called Gender and Architecture, and one of the texts to read was Matrix.
Yeah.
And so it's been an extraordinary... there's a sort of full circle, and I still have the fangirl moments when I meet Joss boys and go, "Oh my God, it's Joss!"
Because we all do that.
Yeah, because it was such a revolutionary text that basically said you need to look at the environment differently, and there were other things that were going on around at that point in time that encouraged that, and it was really reinforced when I went into fifth year, which would be masters now. When we were told that we couldn't have a female tutor because there were none qualified. And yet we were being taught by graduates who were a year out kind of thing. And the whole of my year level went into complete revolt. I just basically stared down the person telling us that and said, this is not acceptable. So it rolls out from there, understanding that people were saying things like there's not enough qualified people to teach you. And then afterwards realising when talking to people who subsequently became colleagues saying, well, no one's done the history. So that's where my PhD started.
All right, I'm going to throw in a wild question here in response, which is this key question of visibility. And this is starting to come out. So I know this is something that Justine's working on at Parlour, but I think the salon or the event that you're going to co-curate at the M Pavilion early next year is also another issue to do with visibility. So maybe we could talk about that as one of the limits and exclusions of the discipline.
No, you go.
Well, if you just go by plain old statistics, I think something like, and I'm not good with stats, but something like half of the Australian population now is either of first generation or second generation migrant background, and a big chunk of that would be from the parts of the world that are closer to us. And, just like following up on Julie's point, our profession doesn't reflect our society by a long shot. And it's not just only that, it often sets up barriers where you have to swim 4 times harder to get a foot in the door, and then you have to swim another 8 times harder to have a seat at any sort of table. And so where that often starts from is this degraded position that is often given to the built knowledge that comes with migrants. We've had emigre architects who have been brilliant, and yet we seem to have amnesia when they're from different parts of the world and go, yep, your built heritage has very little value. It is mostly ancient and incompatible with modern life. I shall not swear. But that is often, what I am trying to, by being as visible as possible, trying to shift that because that's not accurate, and that's led to a lot of gatekeeping.
So the census data, which I can't quite remember the numbers, but I should be able to, be launched on Monday. The census mapping of cultural diversity is kind of weird and crude, and so there's country of birth, there's ancestry, and there's language spoken at home. All of which are kind of, bring their own problems, but they do provide some insight. And if we look at the the group of people who identify as being within the architectural workforce, it may not match the population, but it's quite diverse. It's quite from many, many different places. But that doesn't translate into power and influence. That doesn't translate into... So the workforce, I would argue, is actually relatively diverse, but the image of the profession and the leadership of the profession, and when we looked at it in relation to the pay gap, which tells you enormous amounts about power and privilege, it's fucked. Excuse my language.
I would add the caveat that it is often only at the lowest levels of the profession, and there is huge levels of attrition. Yeah. And I'm saying this as someone who's mentored over 30 people over the past 10 years.
Yeah.
So one of the ways that architectural histories and theories can help is by promoting a recent history, a 20th century history, which is much more diverse. So we already have in our image bank that there are these highly talented, competent architects who practice across the globe, in either globally or in different locations. So there are direct links between what we teach in the history curriculum and the collective memory that forms in each person's individual memory.
And valuing the education. I mean, the number of architects who say, or, migrants, they're very well educated. They have been
many educated here.
The ones, I suppose I'm thinking the ones who have been educated elsewhere very well, who have good practice track records, and they still find it very, very hard to be taken seriously here. And so I know this isn't history, but it's kind of all part of the same thing. And I suppose it's also the knowledge that you bring with you and whether that's valued or not. So. Yeah, and of course then there's the whole question of people. But I mean, I've just had a lot of contact lately from people going, I don't know how to get into this. Like I'm a skilled and experienced architect and I can't get anyone to take me seriously. Sorry, I got off topic.
No, I was thinking of lots of stories I can tell from the encyclopedia about migrants women who fled the Iranian Revolution, then went to America and couldn't continue their careers. Their skill sets weren't recognised, or women who've had to emigrate to get other opportunities. So there are these histories.
Oh. Am I correct that even in Matrix there was a migrant cohort or a diverse cohort?
Diverse cohort, which is it's there from early on, but becomes particularly strong from 92 to 96.
Yeah.
Can we find examples of work, people, or events that have challenged or broadened or expanded architecture's historical field?
There's many.
Well,
yeah.
a book?
I would recommend, I know this is not about cultural diversity, but I would highly recommend everyone reads Women in the Making of the Modern House. I think that's an outstanding publication and particularly interesting because it takes these iconic canonical works and it shows us that there are other stories in them, and then the sort of presence of women as women trying to rethink how they live as clients being really fundamental to the development of the canon of modern architecture. So I do think that's a very fine book. I know I keep rabbiting on about my education, but I do feel like there's a whole lot of really interesting work in New Zealand because I think there's a real interest in what it means. There's a sort of fascination with the gaps, with the stuff that's missing, with the looking at what happens if you look awry, with what happens, what you bring if you come from so-called margins. Because when you're a tiny country at the end of the world and you're trying to find something interesting to say, that's where you start. And I do think there's a lot of work there that's really historiographically interesting and challenging. And I think it would be good if it had more airtime, I have to say.
I just think in relation to a point Sonia made earlier, there was quite a lot of feminist pushback around the way that Zaha Hadid was represented and discussed. But, the connections between that and then if it makes its way into the mainstream of the profession, again, another problem with how do we get that scholarly critique out into the mainstream.
Wikipedia. I can talk about that, but anyway, you two go.
I was really lucky to be a part of this recent anthology called Queer Spaces, which was edited by Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell. And I think, given that, queer people are still criminalized in much of the world and have been, ostracized for most of history, that book was a really exciting project because there were so many different ways that people were able to sort of recover, I guess, lost queer narratives. And, these are people who weren't always recognized as architects, but they're people who created spaces that were safe for them. And I think that kind of goes back to, what we were talking about in terms of exclusion and exclusion from the archives. So, I'm from a country where it's still illegal to be gay. And, that's sort of a legacy of colonialism as well with Section 377A. And so for me, when I was trying to sort of recover, I guess, a queer Malayan history, it was not through writing about queer architects. It was sort of following people who've been, prosecuted for being homosexual. And so, using those sorts of things like court records and newspapers, that allowed me to sort of go, okay, well, these are the places where queer people gathered. These are the places and how they interacted and used space. But it's, a history that you have to recover through these sort of tangential means.
And you've just touched on a really important point, which is the invention of different methodologies to recover these erased or invisible histories. So the use of judicial archives, thinking about how people drive the everyday built environment rather than from the top down through the architectural process. Julie, I know you mentioned Matrix, but were there any others, events?
because my research is on uncovering, part of it is uncovering early women architects. There are a heap of them, and there they are, as many images as I could find of them. Ironically, most of those come from the social pages in newspapers as opposed to the proper architectural record.
Proper.
Sorry?
Proper.
It's amazing when you go back to look at records in a different way as who you can see. And if you have a very clear and limited definition as who an architect is, you won't be able to see them. But if you open that up, you suddenly will. So Soon-Tzu and I have done work, and we suddenly see when we're looking at ostensibly colonial architects working in locations in Asia, that they have all these different people working for them who are offering architectural services, and in some cases are then going on to run firms on their own and doing some quite interesting things. And it's not they may be migrants as well to the places in which they're working. We're not talking single cultural sources for these people in those locations. And it's the same when you look at any person contributing to architecture, that as soon as you open up what architectural production actually is, you will see many, many more people contributing. But part of the issue is, though, you have to be a serious nerd like me to find this, and then it takes time to construct it into a compelling story. It takes an enormous amount of effort to do that. And so many other things are de facto easier to make look sexy and interesting. And this stuff is the real hard slog. Now, I'm really happy being boring, so I sort of wallow away and have a great time. But it is interesting that whenever I'm out presenting my work, I almost inevitably sort of realise that it's just not going to be as interesting to other people as yet another reading of Le Corbusier, which seems to happen at every conference, and so on and so forth. You know, you could substitute in any famous architect will be seen as more exciting than the slightly ordinary practice that I'm often talking about.
I would like to add an event would be Anoma's brilliant exhibition at MoMA with, I've forgotten the co-curators. And I think that's particularly because we were talking about the absence in archive. It's really good to know that, of all the architectural archives, that tends to have its own kind of glitzy appeal, right? So it's good to know that Anoma's work has put South Asian modernisms in there and has finally rewritten Korb and Khan a little out of the picture. In fact, completely out of the picture. So I'm glad that that's in what other people deem as a valuable archive. I don't deem it as the most valuable archive, but I certainly know that other fellow architects would. So if the profession is valuing it and it is there and it is writing a new script, excellent. I would say that MoMA comes with its own kind of baggage. I don't think it's a completely non-colonial institution, but yeah.
I think you've also touched on a really important point, because there are scholars like Vikram Prakash who's been working on Ahmedabad for years, partly because his own father worked there. So he's been picking apart that Korb as the master architect for years, but that translation between scholarship and the exhibition space is critical.
And archive in particular, because so many of those buildings are so rapidly disappearing that if they don't go into an archive, in our rush to embrace peace capitalism, it will just completely be erased, just like many women have been erased.
And just since Sonoma has been mentioned, if I can jump back to books that were really influential, I think until I read Hidden Hands, Divided Landscapes, everything I'd read on Malaysian and Singaporean architecture had very much focused on the big firms, usually run by British people. And if they talked about Asian architects, it was sort of, wealthy sort of Chinese patrons of mansions and things. And I remember reading that book, and, it looked at indentured laborers and how critical they were to, these monumental buildings. And that really shaped sort of my understanding of, sort of Singapore's colonial landscape.
Noma Pires, who we're talking about, was scheduled to be on this panel tonight. And it's so lovely that so many people are honouring her work. She had to go interstate, so unfortunately couldn't join us, but you can see from the discussion what an enormous influence she is, both within the school and globally in terms of her scholarship.
Can I go back to the thing about visibility? Because I think, Julia, I absolutely, I haven't been in an archive myself for a long time, but there's a wonderful pleasure and a total tedium of the archive, and I, it's enormous amounts of work, and as you say, what makes it into the public realm is a tiny part of that work, and it's really important. I suppose something I'm, you all know, I bang on about all the time too, is getting that knowledge that's created there and out to a wider audience. So I know that detailed scholarly papers are very important, and for many, many reasons. But I guess I'm also very interested in how you get that material out to a larger audience. And so I think your book is really important. And if I think about what happens with Parlour, so we have an Instagram account that has like a really substantial following, and every week we have a different guest host. This week, in fact, the person who's hosting it is highlighting migrant women within her workplace. Whenever someone puts up content about a woman architects from history, it's devoured, because people are, the sort of broad profession out there who follow what we do are hungry for that work. Whenever people have loves this week, and I know, the publication that you've just done with Mariam Goucher, Mariana Lozanovska, and Marika Noy-Stepney about migrant women architects. I'm just watching the ripples of that and the comments that are coming through all the time from people who are in it about what a difference it's made and the solidarity that helps create. So I think these projects, which are about the very detailed, fine-grained work, is absolutely essential. And then I think, and I know that, that migration issue was an enormous amount of work. And what it did is it asked a whole lot of women, so you should talk to this, sorry.
So we put a call out across various unis in the profession for migrant women in architecture, and not specifically in practice in and around architecture. And we received way more stories than we could fit, 100 over plus, all so incredibly hard to choose from. And then we chose 24 from then, but then we were very clear that was only stage one of a larger project. And that just came out in September? Yeah, September, the Architect Victoria issue. And I remember receiving an email the day after it came out from one of the participants, and she said, when that issue arrived and she opened it at her office lunch table, all her colleagues suddenly started peeking over her shoulder, going, "Where's that? Where's that?" And then suddenly everybody was feeling comfortable enough to share their inbuilt knowledge that they had come to this country with. And it just took that to prompt those conversations. And she's been in that office for like 2 years. And they can all see each other across the room, but nobody wants to have these conversations because there's such a degraded status to that knowledge that you keep so much in.
And what this issue asks, is it asks people to do two things, to identify, I can't remember what the first one was, but the second
one is their pathway into architecture.
Pathway.
Identify a key architectural environment they grew up in, that personal story connection. And then the last is to introduce a prominent architect from their country of origin.
Yeah. And I know Mariam was particularly keen to, so I guess it's slightly going back to the history question, but again, to open up and to sort of respect that knowledge and to open up this whole kind of world of architecture that many of the readers of Architect Victoria probably have no no knowledge of or access to. And so I think that's, that
Not a single architect among them.
I think that some got weeded out, right?
So as a historian, I would call that histories of the present. It's really important because it's people's life journeys, which is fundamental to how we make our careers.
But it was also pulling history from all sorts of places into the present. That so I thought, and just a taste, but it's been, I think, very interesting watching the ripples on that.
Well, it's very interesting that, Sonia, you mentioned that the knowledge has been constructed as so degraded because, and this relates to the structure of history, that we might talk about living in globalised conditions and there's such a huge push to write globalised histories, but unless the knowledge questions that underlie that history are fundamentally changed or challenged, we're still working from the same kind of knowledge paradigm. It's just, we're going to expand the range of names within the paradigm or the history, different intellectual and political commitments drive these challenges to architectural history. Can we discuss these either through published work or your own experience? So I guess I'm thinking here about the way in which the struggle for decolonisation drives history writing, for example, or queer rights.
I think, it's an ever-changing project. So in, sort of the immediate aftermath of decolonisation, with independence of countries, certainly in Malaysian history, there was a real rush to try and create, I guess, a national history and create a new canon. But as time goes by, it's sort of, an ever-widening project, I guess, because we still do carry these assumptions from the colonial era. There are still sort of injustices and inequalities that are built into, the legal and political system. And so, architecture, and I don't think architectural history can solve those problems, but it's one way of sort of, I guess, unpacking and unpicking some of those issues. And so it's part of this broader, I guess, attempt to reconcile our histories and find a way to move forward.
Well, there's no doubt that the sort of raising of consciousness in particular areas encourages more people to examine what is available on that topic and then to go out and research it further. And so there is a strong correlation between wanting to understand the histories that might be relevant to whatever change in social mores are going on. So there's always that good correlation. Inevitably, there is not enough information for people at the time that they want it, but it is hard to add those catalytic moments where this suddenly becomes something that more people are interested in. And scholars are not immune to wanting an audience for their work, so they will make choices about what they study, thinking about what reception it may have. So they're not...
I don't think you should be immune. I think you should be cultivating audiences.
No, I understand that, but you do, when people are making choices, they are influenced by a whole lot of
course. And what gets funded? I mean, let's talk about what gets funded.
And sometimes they'll have supervisors saying, no, that's not a good topic. Yes, it is. So that can also have an effect on what is researched and why.
And I think this is a sort of possibly a slightly narrow view, but I think quite often it's also about trying to make space for yourself and people like you in the world. It's not, I don't think all work is driven by that by any means, but I think there's a component of that. And I know, if I quote Paul again, I know him talking about teaching history with, large groups of international students, of trying to, encouraging people to be able to bring their knowledge with them, that it's not that their kind of knowledge from all over the world is something that's valuable in the classroom. It's not something to be sort of put aside as you concentrate on the bloody European canon.
I'm going to try not to rant. because you mentioned decolonization and politics, what I do want to vent over is that we're so far from it because our perceptions are still quite changed by borders that were created from colonial outcomes. I particularly think I am qualified to say this because India as a concept did not exist prior to the British. So if you can wrap your head around the facts that Europe is ridiculously diverse, you can wrap around your heads the fact that India is actually 40, 50 different nations just cobbled together. So the fact that our perception is still defined by those borders, Indian architecture, Pakistani architecture, I think that's part of the baggage we haven't left behind. We're still bound to those bigger markers, and there needs to be this fine-grained thinking and this ability to set the clock past that point, which it doesn't.
So this is one of the arguments of the turn to globalised histories of architecture as attempts to move beyond the nation state. Lots of problems with that, including that it doesn't necessarily engage in the powerful agendas, laws, etc. that the nation state has set that has shaped and produced the architecture that comes out of it, but some kind of dynamic that's able to move in a nuanced way between those two things. Okay, so maybe we'll have one more question and then we'll open it up to comments or questions from the audience. Engagement with history occurs on many different sites with many different audiences, from the classroom to scholarly books to historic house museums to documentaries, Instagram. Can we discuss the different sites for the production and reception of history and how we might use those different sites? We've talked a little bit about some, but maybe we can have a slightly more fulsome discussion.
Can I talk about Wikipedia? Okay. So we all know Wikipedia is not the most reliable source, but it is a source for many people, including many of us, when we need something. And some years ago now, I can't remember the date, Despina Strategakos wrote a very compelling essay about the absence of women, particularly from the version of architecture that was portrayed on Wikipedia. And that was read by many people. It was on Places, it's still there, including Karen and my colleague and friend Laurie Brown in New York, me, various other people. And I remember thinking, oh God, we should do something about that, and not doing anything. And then I got an email from Laurie going, fellow feminists, we need to do something about this. And Laurie set up a sort of Wikipedia editing sessions, around the world, or she encouraged people to do that. Sorry, this is a bit of a history itself, but it's going somewhere. We did one madly enthusiastically. Of course, we can do this, and then watched as all of our entries were rejected or challenged or dismissed, or because we knew really nothing about how to write for Wikipedia. And that kind of obviously got our backs up. And so we decided to do something. And so Laurie, myself, and a group, Parla Architects and a group in Berlin put together a grant, application which we got. And we set to understanding how Wikipedia worked. And yes, it is a weird parallel universe with very many strange rules. And yes, it's very biased. But you can intervene in it. And so, and you can, once you've worked out the rules, you can, work around them. And we spent a number of years, and Charity Edwards and Alicia Bennett were very instrumental in this, writing women in Australian architecture into Wikipedia. And now, I haven't looked lately, but like a year ago, if you went to look at the list of Australian architects on Wikipedia, there's many more women than men, because nobody was racing around writing the men at the same time. So it's this sort of fabulous parallel universe. It's problematic. The criteria for notability are very biased. Well, they're very reliant on the art criteria. So again, they really underscore that singular genius thing. They won't take oral history sources. There have to be published sources. It's actually like done properly. It's quite a conventional version of history. It's very abstract. You can't have adjectives. It's very objective and dry, and you have your sources. But it's quite, we can intervene in the biggest encyclopedia in the world. We can write that stuff in, and I think that, and to do that, we need the work that you do, Julie. We can't do it without having your books and your encyclopedias sitting there next to us. But I have been trying to get people who teach architectural history, for example, to have this as part of an assessment program for years, because it's quite conventional history practice, and it's incredibly liberating and exciting to see that you can have an impact in the world like that. So I know RMIT have been doing it for a while with Stuart, I think, was leading it, but it's not. I just think all of this scholarly work that's going on, that goes into journals, that can be very influential with one group of people and completely inaccessible to those of us who don't have library cards for university libraries. Just pulling that work into short, sharp things on Wikipedia, that was a good thing. Anyway.
Sonia, you've mentioned print media with your recent publication, and you've got a project with the M Pavilion. So maybe you could talk about those two mediums.
Actually, I was going to talk about a third medium if I can.
Perfect.
Now, architecture is a funny medium. It's so visual that tends to get precedence over everything else. So, of course, we have a lot of publications, obviously, for that reason. That's our Achilles heel. However, I actually see great potential, particularly when I'm talking about these knowledges that have disappeared or been degraded, etc. I really see potential for docu-series in the future. I mean, let's also admit all of our attention spans are getting shorter. So a whole documentary people would struggle to sit through. Anybody know anyone at Netflix? I will pitch this. But the docu-series, I think, has the benefit of being able to draw on those oral records, because as you said, oral records really can't go into a lot, and you can't really do with it in a print medium. So I think the docu-series has got great potential for the next generation in particular. That's just my 2 cents.
Mariam, who we spoke about just before, has been today videoing and filming in mosques in Sydney. So there's a really interesting project that she's involved with scholars from South Australia, of looking at the ways in which, I think, I can't quite remember, but it's relatively ordinary buildings are transformed for religious purposes.
Yeah, and docu-series more because also a documentary tends to focus on the hero, but a docu-series can build a complex picture over time. If we can do it for celebrities, we can do it for architecture.
Such a brilliant idea. We'll be working on the pitch at dinner, I think. Soon-Tzu, have you got?
Yeah, I think, social media is a really interesting one because it has democratized, discussions of architecture and heritage and things. And I think, I follow lots of these Instagram accounts that are just, basically people who are interested in their built environment, who are documenting, often quite mundane places that they see. And, that's been an interesting way to get, I guess, stuff that isn't, part of the canon or major works represented. But I think, going back to what you said, there's often that disjunct between, architectural historians have been talking about decolonization and feminism for ages. And one thing I do see on social media is there's often a lot of received wisdom that then, perpetuates the stereotypes and the old narratives. And I think finding a way to reach out to those audiences and bring, I guess, some of this scholarship without the jargon to broader audiences is really important.
Although I've just discovered an Instagram account, I think it's from Malaysia, certainly from Southeast Asia, about data visualization and decolonization. It's fantastic. It's like, I would not have known, this is really good. So it's like anything, I guess there's gems in these, but I think you're right, the reinscription of cliches, I don't know, it just feels relentless, doesn't it?
As Julie said, it's a shortcut, but it's also very comforting.
Mm.
You know, it's a mythology about architecture that's comforting. So we might finish with Julie.
Well, I absolutely agree that getting out to a wider audience is important, but I'm going to put a pitch in for the actual hard slog of
Absolutely.
the material.
We need you to do that so we can stack around on Instagram.
Because if you don't do that, misinformation can be promulgated. And so we really need both.
Mm.
And we need deep thinking about what these things mean and how that can be then translated into change in one way or another. So it feels sometimes as though it's just about the sort of Instagram story, but actually it's about the whole gamut of doing the hard slog through to that final bit of dissemination.
Absolutely. That's the foundation.
I'd go and sit in an archive if someone would pay me.
We'll have to discuss that afterwards. All right, I'm going to turn around a bit to our audience. Does anyone have a question or a comment? Yes.
I don't know if you know much about the third space, or have you heard that story? The third space is the parks or the eco villages so you have these different emotions for people where they move in a small area and how the architecture, and if you had sharp edges, that sort of agitates people. Its reds and yellows might go over to purples and blues, and knowing that colour through the third space. Does anyone have heard of it?
Well, not specifically the third space, but there has been quite a big surge of scholarship looking at the connection between emotions and in other disciplines, sort of just starting in architecture, but thinking about the emotions that we can feel, imagine, connect to as we move around built environments. I mean, Julie's been working for a number of years around the relationship between health and environment, but those kinds of emotional connections are a really important part of that space as well. So, but I think we might need to go and investigate the third space.
Yeah, and that's what I felt. I worked at Melbourne Uni for 12 years, and I do toilet paper, so that's all had to be in my brain. But I was a landscape designer and designed in India gardens and veggie gardens like Veg Art down in St Kilda and eco villages. But what I'm getting at is many people come here for photography. So the movement of where the old lake was here, where we're sitting, there was an old lake, and then the creek that went down. And you see, as you're moving, there's little negative lines, and then there's positive lines, like the First Nation people mention. So that's that third space. Like you get the beautiful architecture when you go towards old arts and the arches. And one day we just did pictures of arches, arch windows, and it was just nice to feel Melbourne University with these photographers and see it through their eyes and architecture.
Yeah, and that's a really important part of the teaching and learning experience, trying to find those other ways into the built environment.
Feeler. Because we're many languages, many cultures, many movements, like muscle memory. So we got the little veggie garden across out there, and then the little kiddies come in and go to those. But because universities are coming more like homes and cultivating that feeling between, say, architecture and people living locally or in regard to students, this is their place. And, architecture holds those memories when people return like 20 years later, unless it's all been pulled down.
One of the feminist interventions we made with this exhibition was to ask to have the carpet retained from an exhibition that had been held here previously. And Dan Hill had suggested originally that we think about using the gallery as a teaching space. People could hold their classes here. So it's trying to make it feel like a more receptive environment. And it has been successful in that way. We've actively changed the space here. Now we've all got sort of different histories of how the space could be used. So does anyone else have a question or a comment or a story you'd like to tell from your own experience? I can ask the panel more questions too if you'd like to hear more from our stars.
We could all have dinner.
Hi. So I was interested by your comment about how when you learned history of architecture, you thought it was quite broad and through many perspectives. I go to university here. I'm in the Masters of Architecture. And while I think those kinds of things are acknowledged, the multiplicity of perspectives, I don't think it's ingrained into the way that histories are actually taught at this university. I don't know if that's a, controversial statement to make to you guys, but I'm interested in what kind of steps does it actually take for a big institution like this and like many others in the world to actually begin to decolonize the way that we're taught and to ingrain just the way that modern people actually think into big institutions like this. How do you actually begin to make sure that feminism is ingrained, for example? Is it a hard task?
No, I wasn't going to ask you because it's not appropriate. I might take that first and then direct it to the panel, but I think change happens internally and externally. So one of the most important things that's happened in architecture is in the last couple of years is that the register panel that comes around that formally assesses architecture schools so that the degree that you get from this school is ratified and counts towards your professional qualifications. They have placed students learning Indigenous design knowledge as part of the two most important things that must change in curriculum and that students must know: sustainability and Indigenous design knowledges. And that has already had an immediate impact on our master's program. If you came into Studio C this year, you would have experienced that under Janet McGaw's leadership. So I think that's going to drive enormous change. Look, I think there are people who have worked really hard to change the curriculum in this faculty. So you're in the 200 points masters. I teach in the 300 points masters, and I teach the period 1965 to 2000, and I make sure there are women featured in my lecture every week and that there are texts by women. Obviously, it's one of my specialty interests. But
and I do too. Whenever I'm lecturing, I point out wherever I can women practitioners. I lectured this week into first year and was talking about that. But some of the concepts you're talking about are difficult to tie specifically down to curriculum. I know that sounds like I'm dodging the issue, but feminism as a concept is not a curriculum. It's a whole way of being. And it's making sure that there are a diverse number of people who are teaching you. It is thinking about what is said in classes. It is thinking about, yes, curriculum, but that's only a tiny part of it. So there's not an easy answer here. And as Karen has pointed out, there is quite a large burden from accreditation points of view that we need to make sure that you have the skills that are needed for professional qualification and future practice that we don't really have a choice about. So that makes the opportunities for the kinds of things that you would want to see more limited than if it was a completely free curriculum. And we struggle with that balance all the time. But also note that social mores change very, very rapidly. Universities aren't quite as easy to shift, turn the tide, so to speak.
Driving a very large ocean liner.
I don't know. I'm happy for now. So I might get in trouble for this. But
Say it before you say everything.
no, I generally have a talent for getting into trouble. So you would know from your own experience that I suppose your most intimate interactions in your architecture course is your one-on-one sort of your tutorial, whether it's design or theory, right? So I, by day, teach a NOMA subject on Asia-Pacific modernities. By night, which is not actually true, but it's in the same tutorial, what I'm actually doing is encouraging each of my students to shed those shackles in their own mind, which often they're not even aware they're carrying. So that decolonization, so to speak, right? But on an individual level, going question, why? Why do you believe this? Why do you see it this way? And often it's uncomfortable for them. I obviously done very respectfully, but towards the end, it achieves that outcome of letting them have faith in their own voice and in their own perspectives. Because if you don't have that, you're constantly stifled. So I try to do that on a tutorial level because I appreciate that, yes, institutions take a long time, but I also realize that that's the most impactful level that I can contribute to, which is that one-on-one interaction.
And it's the angle you bring to your work. It's the it's the perspective you bring to the studio. It's the perspective you bring to the essay you're writing. I'm not saying that it's all it's all on you, but as a student, there's a lot of room as well. I mean, I don't know, my daughter's second year student at the VCA, I don't think she's ever written an essay that hasn't been about feminism. I think she should maybe try something else. But, it's like, it's all, in all of the things she's had, there's been that potential to do that. I mean, I'm so interested in the competencies because I think I think the rise of it's not just Indigenous design knowledge, it's Indigenous cultural competency is this massive and important shift. And running that through the competencies makes, structural change very fast. But I also feel like architecture degrees are so constrained by all the stuff that has to get jammed into them. So I can talk about my education was wacky and loose and all over the show. And I was really shocked when I came to Australia and found it was much more, and maybe, New Zealand is now like this too, but much more focused on core. We had very little core and we had a huge amount of choice, which meant we had quite uneven education. But I would still argue that is a good thing because it teaches you that there's always more to learn. But I think the thing of, the professional accreditation processes place so much emphasis on core knowledge, which I've got to say, I think is a bit of a furphy even when you're a practitioner. Like there's many different kinds of core knowledge that you can have, but I do think that, so, yeah, I mean, I'm not an academic, I'm not a teacher, but I think the institutions operate in these very complex circumstances but I do think as a student, you can make room as well,
But I think it's important to centre your experience, and that's your experience. And
yeah.
So one of the ideas behind this exhibition was to show that there's a lot of people in this faculty who work on women or gender or feminist issues. They don't necessarily always have visibility. And so this was about drawing attention to this huge cohort. There's some discussion now about setting up a women's network in the faculty. There's a student group that's been established. A student came up and told me about that a couple of weeks ago. So what we're seeing is a sort of rising tide of visibility. So I think I'm hoping.
I think that's a very interesting point though, Karen. I'm saying there's this great scholarship that's sitting in journals and the rest of us find it very hard to access or don't even know it exists. And I think this is part of that. But also, how that feeds into teaching, how that feeds into studio, it might not be able to feed always into lecture-based courses, but it can, how you not just communicate that with the profession, but how it's communicated to a student body, because there's some very inventive, very challenging work that goes on. And I don't know. It's very easy for me to pontificate because I don't have to look at Julie. Don't make it work.
Also, there's some, talk to us afterwards and we'll give you some tips and stay in touch. And because I think it's really important that those of us who are embedded in full-time ongoing positions in the faculty can support our students who are looking for other kinds of experiences or would like to talk to us about the experiences that they've had. So let's connect afterwards, and I'll give you my email. You can see Helene for a show there. So, you know, this is part of what we need to do as feminists, is provide solidarity. So thank you for your question. I think that's this. Yeah. Yes, sorry. Would you like to ask a question or make a comment?
With this curriculum, was that also constrained by financial reasons from the university, not from you?
The development of curriculum anyway.
That if you wish to introduce certain things and maybe it's not acceptable or not the money for it
Well, that hasn't been my experience. I went through a fantastic experience with Helene in the undergraduate degree over the last 2 years, introducing a new first-year subject, which is a settler Indigenous history of Melbourne, a site-based history. The faculty gave us funding to employ a research assistant. We were really financially supported to develop those resources. And of all I've worked in, I think, 7 different academic departments at various institutions. This is the one that most well funds course curriculum, in my experience. So
it's interesting because we used to, in the history faculty, we used to have women's studies program, which went for about 30 years, and then it was chopped. And, you know, doesn't matter which area in the uni, you could have had access to take that as a subject, but that's gone. And so, you know, I find it admirable that you're organising and that your faculty really does this, but it's negative for the others who are doing arts and that don't have.
Absolutely. And what we've seen across the university system in Australia, particularly now with the Australian Catholic University and in the US and the UK, I can't speak to other areas, is the attack on the humanities as part of this so-called vocationally focused mindset. And it's incredibly sad, and the undervaluing of that knowledge and skills. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, it's just I feel sorry for the young ones that are coming up and wouldn't have that opportunity, you know, to take part in something like that.
I think we should draw this evening to a close, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our fine 4 panellists. Thank you.